This election year seems like no other in history, with the pandemic, protests against racial injustice, and natural disasters. This week, I spoke with University of Minnesota political science professor Dr. Catherine Pearson about the coming election, and I began by asking her what, in Minnesota's political landscape, jumps out at her.
There's no question that it is a volatile election, that constantly there's new information, news is breaking, and that people are very concerned about the state of the country, the state of the state. And so partisans on both sides of the aisle are thinking more about the election than usual. And I expect that voter turnout will be very high. So there's a lot about this election that's very unusual. But that said, I do expect that just like in typical contemporary elections, 90% of Republicans will vote for the Republican candidates and 90% of Democrats will vote for the Democratic candidates. So even though this election, for many reasons, is more intense, I actually don't expect that there's going to be a lot of persuasion happening from one party to the other.
What about those undecideds, though?
There are certainly undecideds, and in a state as narrowly divided as Minnesota, undecideds can make a critical difference. But there are many fewer undecideds than there used to be. Political science research is pretty clear about that, and that even people who identify initially in polls as, well, I'm an independent, but I lean toward this party or lean toward the other party, the party that they say they lean toward, they actually vote with pretty consistently. And so people may think of themselves as sort of independent and discerning, but most people do lean toward one party or the other. And among those who don't, there are often those who make up their mind at the very last minute because they don't pay a lot of attention to politics until the last minute. But again, in such a volatile year with so much going on, I think a lot of people are paying a lot more attention to politics than usual.
President Trump has nominated Judge Amy Coney Barrett to succeed Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. It appears likely that the U.S. Senate will that they will confirm her. What, if any, impact do you see this having on Minnesota's election?
I see there's going to be a lot of conversation about this and on both sides of the aisle, but I don't expect that it would change many people's vote choice. It may change sort of the considerations, the priorities when people are thinking about who they're going to vote for, but it's unlikely that for all but a very narrow segment of voters that it would change this election, because it's not surprising that President Trump appoints a Supreme Court justice. It was sort of with a similar ideology to his other picks. And it's not surprising that Democrats are upset, both about the judicial philosophy of the nominee, but that also in an election year so close to the election that Republicans are going ahead with this, when in 2016, Republican leader Mitch McConnell and Republicans in the Senate wouldn't consider President Obama's nominee, Merrick Garland. And so the Senate confirmation will certainly take up a lot of, time in the media, and people will be focused on it, but it also won't take away from other concerns like COVID-19, the economy, and other concerns on voters' minds. So once again, this is just an election with so many issues at the forefront, but these issues are by and large not necessarily going to change very many people's minds, only solidify and harden the support for the candidates that they were already inclined to support.
Well, and this next question may piggyback on what you just said a little bit, because, most days the presidential election sucks the air out of the room. But in terms of statewide offices, how long are those coattails? You mentioned independents really lean one way or another way, but, with this presidential race, how big is that impact on statewide elections?
Well, it matters. It matters because political science research shows that increasingly people do not split their votes when it comes to voting for a presidential candidate of one party and a member of Congress or a congressional candidate of another party. It used to actually be quite common that incumbents would win by wide margins, even if voters were casting a vote for an incumbent and a presidential candidate of another party. And now, by and large, voters tend to vote for the same party all the way down, or at least most of the way down the ticket. Now, there's some notable exceptions to that, like in Minnesota's 7th district, where, for example, 4 years ago, President Trump won Minnesota's 7th congressional district by about 20 points. an incumbent Democrat, Colin Peterson, was reelected. And so there are races like that where the incumbent's fate depends on voters splitting their ticket. But by and large across the country, especially when candidates are less well known to people, people don't tend to vote to split their ticket in the way that they used to.
You've written a book on how party leaders wield their power to reward or punish members and maintain discipline in the United States House of Representatives. I wonder, are those political tactics trickling down to state levels now in terms of party leaders using those same kinds of tactics to keep their party members in line?
To a certain extent, yes. With 50 states, there is some variation, but we see over and over again the trends of partisan polarization and party unity within each party and against the other party being very high. And that divided government, which actually right now, Minnesota is the only state that has a state house of one party and a state senate of the other, that, the parties are really at odds with one another, and party leaders need, especially when the margins are close, party leaders need that loyalty of every member. And so whether it's leadership races or committee assignments or getting one's bills to the floor, party loyalty does matter, and party leaders take that into consideration, whether in the US House, the US Senate, or in state houses across the country. There are some caveats to that, and that is, as we get close to an election, party leaders also want to make sure that they can really help their most vulnerable incumbents get reelected. So if they're going to give some members a pass, it's going to be those vulnerable members who need to win for a party to either keep their majority or get to majority party status.
Now, many analysts, including you, now see Minnesota as a swing state. Is the makeup of political parties changing in Minnesota? In other words, is the DFL party losing some of those farmers and laborers?
Yes, it is. And we see similar trends in Minnesota that we're seeing at the national level. So in sparsely populated, more rural areas of the state, we're seeing Republicans making inroads. We see that all over the country, and we're seeing it in Minnesota. Minnesota's 1st district in southern Minnesota, Minnesota's 8th district in northern Minnesota. Those were two of the only districts in 2018 that actually switched from Democrat to Republican, where at the same time in Minnesota, you had Minnesota's 2nd district and 3rd district switch from Republican to Democratic because, like the rest of the country, those suburban and exurban areas are increasingly going Democratic. And so Minnesota's geography is such that the party alignments are more in sync with the rest of the country. But yes, Democrats are losing a lot of ground in more sparsely populated areas of greater Minnesota because that DFL farmer labor coalition has really broken up.
Now, this may be a little bit out of your wheelhouse, but I'd like you to weigh in on the social media outlets like Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. How are they shaping the tone and the rhetoric and the divisiveness that we're seeing in today's political environment, particularly, at the state level, but it's happening nationally as well?
Well, there's no doubt that they are intensifying the partisan conflict that we're already seeing, and the social media and all that goes with that really makes it even harder for parties to work across the aisle and compromise, because the minute someone reaches out to the other party, it's all over social media, and one's own partisans are going to get very upset. Now, sometimes social media can have the benefit of spreading knowledge and information to voters who might not otherwise get it, but the problem is it's filtered. And so people aren't getting news from multiple sources, typically through social media. It tends to be their own bubble reinforcing partisan views, and indeed sometimes news that's just not accurate, or news that may have some truth, but without any context can be misleading.
We are still 4 weeks away from Election Day, and as we are noticing, breaking news is constant. For example, the New York Times has new reports on President Trump's tax returns. Here in Minnesota, we have reports of ballot harvesting. Do these so-called October surprises still impact the election?
Well, I think, in both cases, context is necessary, and that it also depends on how the follow-up goes. I expect that we'll be hearing a lot more, both from former Vice President Biden, but also other Democrats, about President Trump's taxes. And so the extent to which Democrats can sort of use that successfully, I think will determine how great of a campaign issue it is for Democrats, but I also think it's very likely that strong supporters of the president really won't be swayed by this information. President Trump has already made clear over the past several years that he doesn't think that the New York Times is a credible source of information. The fact checking of this reporting notwithstanding. And so I think it really depends on how independent voters, and again, there are fewer of them, but how independent viewers, how often they see this information and the context that's provided, and then any follow-up with the information about ballots as well. I just think in that particular case, a lot more investigation will be done, and a lot of fact-checking, and that will sort of determine how this plays out.
Dr. Catherine Pearson, I want to thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you.